It's time to meet the resume. You're going to use this template to build your resume, and we'll reference back to it throughout the rest of the course. So let's take a look at exactly what you're going to be working with. I've put this template together specifically to match how applicant tracking systems work and process your resume. This also is optimized so that when a person's reading it, they're going to be immediately drawn to the most important parts of your resume. This means things like your career profile are at the very top to get people super interested in you as a candidate, and then the details are further down on the resume. Let's walk through each part. Again, we'll come back to all of this in more detail, except for a few spots that I'll elaborate on right now. First, as with any resume you'd expect, your name is going to be front and center at the top. We want it to stand out for them to easily connect back to you. Here, use whatever name that you typically go by. If your name is Jennifer, but you go by Jen, which is my case, I might put Jen on my resume as my first name, because then each time I talk with that person, they're connecting back to me personally. If you have a really common name, then you may want to use a middle initial as well. So if your name's John Smith, you might want to go by John R. Smith on your name for your resume, even if you don't typically reference your middle initial otherwise. The idea here is to make sure that you're really distinguishing yourself from other candidates and that you don't get confused with another John Smith that's applying for the job. So once your name's on it, it's time for contact information. Again, we keep this front and center because we want it to be really easy for the hiring manager or recruiter or HR to know exactly how to get a hold of you. Go ahead and put your city or state. If you live out of country from where the job is, then list the country as well. List your email and a contact number, preferably your cell phone. Definitely avoid putting a work contact number. I have seen people do this on resumes before, and it can create an issue. One, because you're likely going to leave the job. That's why you're applying for other jobs. But it's also not very professional to take a job interview at work while you're doing a different job. So also here, email. There's no excuse to not have a good professional email, preferably some combination of your initials or first and last names. You can get a free email, so if you don't have one that's professional that you're using in your day-to-day life, then get a separate one. And you can always set up that second email to forward to your regular email address so you don't miss anything and also don't feel like you have to frequently check it. It's also so easy to sync multiple emails on your phone that you could get alerts from that second email address that way as well. One other thing to keep in mind on email, make sure that you don't have a signature that would be off-putting in a professional setting. A lot of people don't bother with signatures at all, and that's fine, and some people have them. Just make sure if you have an email signature that it's something professional, something simple, maybe just your name. Don't relate back to your personal hobbies or other things that are really irrelevant to the hiring manager and may seem really odd when they get an email from you and see your signature.
Optionally, in this section, you could also add a link to your LinkedIn profile after your phone number, or you could even add in a link to another portfolio located somewhere else. If you need to, you can leave off the city and state. I would recommend doing this perhaps if you're moving to a new location, just so that people don't immediately rule you out from being located off-site or at a distance from where the position is.
All right, that takes care of you and how to get a hold of you. So let's walk through the rest of the resume, and everything else that we're going to go through here, we'll go through in more detail in the next section of the course. The first thing that we're going to highlight after we highlight who you are and how to get a hold of you is your career profile. So when we talk about career profile, this is about who you are, what you've accomplished, and your key skills. The thing that makes this different from highlights is we're summing up your entire career in 1 or 2 sentences. At the very most, your career profile will be 50 words long, and generally we want it to be much shorter. This should be the ultimate highlight sentence or two about who you are and why you're a fantastic candidate for the job. We'll get into more details, but what we want to do here is really hook in the interviewer, the person that's reading your resume, so that they want to know more. Most recruiters and hiring managers spend about 5 to 6 seconds looking at a resume and deciding whether they're going to read the rest of it or not. So this is your opportunity in those first 5 seconds to hook them in and have them say, I need to know more, so they go on to the rest of your resume. Once we've got them hooked, we're going to reel them in even more by talking about highlights. So career highlights. This is going to be 3 to 4 bullet points on how you've generated revenue, saved money, optimized infrastructure processes to operate more efficiently. These are the key takeaways that are going to apply to that next job. And the reason we're going to focus in these areas is because these are areas that consistently come up as things that are important to companies. So we're going to make sure we're selling you and selling your skills and your expertise in a way that really speaks to companies.
From here, we move on to talking about projects. This is an optional section which we'll talk more about when we get to that portion of the course. For some people, especially if you're brand new to analytics, I'd recommend having the projects up here. And if you have related education, you might also put that before your work experience. However, if you do have related work experience, any projects you add may be better placed towards the end. With the projects, we're going to focus on potential business impact, even if they weren't business-related projects. I recommend 2 to 3 projects on your resume, picking ones that are most relevant. Again, we'll get into more detail in that section of the course. Next, let's talk about work experience.
And here in reverse chronological order, so starting with your most recent position, we're going to go through and list out each of your relevant positions and a few bullet points about each. This is set up in a very specific format. This employer name, position title, and month, year setup is very specific for how applicant tracking systems read resumes. So this will make sure that when your resume gets pulled into these systems and configured around, that it still tells them everything that you're actually trying to say on your resume. The reason we're going to list month and year and not specific dates or just years is it's usually easiest to figure out the month. The day is not so important. But by showing month and year, we also show if there are or are not gaps in your employment. Whereas if you put year, a lot of employers are going to assume that you chose to just list the year because you had a gap in employment. Don't worry about being too particular here. If you know roughly that you started in the summer in one position and you don't know if it was June or July, it's not going to matter that much. Just pick one and go with it. The idea here is more to show the continuous flow and any major gaps that you may have had. Then I mentioned we're going to put a few bullet points to highlight the specifics of what you did in each of those positions. So we'll go through in more detail soon on how to do that. Once you go through work experience, and I've left a lot of room for this, but you can certainly create more or take away if you don't need them, we're going to touch on your education. The reason that we don't put education at the top is because we really want to show what you've basically been able to demonstrate with those education or certification and other skills that you have within the work experience and highlights. So now we're going to get into more of the details, more of almost a checklist format of things that you've done or things that you've accomplished. So here we'll list out education, college or university, your degree name and concentration. If you have multiple degrees, then those would get listed here as well. If you don't have a degree, you can just leave off the education section. Certifications. This is a completely optional section, but if you do have professional certifications, maybe you're a project manager or a certified SaaS programmer, then you would go ahead and put those on here to highlight to the person reading your resume that you are certified in certain areas. On certifications, don't list really generic ones. I would definitely omit anything that references Microsoft Office Suite unless you're in a position or entering a position where the job application heavily mentions repeatedly certain Microsoft programs or other common computer programs. Don't list it on your resume. Everyone's assuming that if you're applying for the job, you've got the basic skills. You know how to use Excel, you know how to use Word, you know how to write an email. Those aren't things to highlight on a resume. Then publications and presentations, also something optional, but if you've published works or given presentations that either apply to the job or demonstrate skills that you'll need in the job, list them here. Professional organizations, again, anything that is a professional organization that could loosely or directly tie to the job you're applying for. This isn't the place to put organizational affiliations that aren't related to the job. If you're applying for a technical position, you're probably not going to list your church group here, even if it's something that you're involved in, because that's not really a professional organization. Lastly, we have the skills section. This is a completely optional section. It's much better to be able to show your skills in your job history than it is to just have a separate list. Because when we go back and put them in the work experience, we're able to talk about exactly what you accomplished, what that skill allowed you to do. It also demonstrates you can actually use that skill. It's not uncommon for people to have a skill list that's not entirely factual, and so including a lot of those skills in the work experience can go a long way to demonstrating that you actually have those skills and know how to apply them in a workplace setting. This doesn't mean that you have to leave the skills section off, and there will certainly be some fields where it makes a lot of sense to have a skills list. If you do a lot of programming and are familiar with a lot of different languages or different applications, maybe you want to put that here. We'll also put it in the work experience, but putting it in the skills could be good. Again, we'll go through all of these in more detail as we get into the next section of the course. The other thing that I've done to help make this a little more straightforward to use is within your course resources, there's a resume quick guide, so you can decide which sections you're going to include. So if you go to that section, you'll be able to see all of the different section names we went through, who it's best for, what content should be in it, and then I've left a spot so you can mark, are you going to include it on your resume or not? So again, go into the course resources and you'll be able to make use of this for yourself.